Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Vicki, and thank you all for joining me this evening. I'm very passionate about this topic. The presentation's called Caregivers Have Feelings Too, A Guide to Self-Care. But what I'm passionate about is I've done a lot of work with kids and kids who are struggling, and what I find is it's exhausting and it's hard work for parents. And I like to approach supporting kids as a team. Nobody could do it by themselves. So as the therapist who's working with the kid, I need parents aligned. We need school on board. You know, the saying, it takes a village. We all play a part in it. And one thing that I think is so important when you're working on a team is making sure everyone on the team is doing well and taking care of themselves. And so often I find parents whose kids are struggling often neglect their own needs because they're so focused on their children and their family. And so I am honored to be that you're choosing to spend your very limited and precious time this evening to listen to some suggestions or ways that you can also support yourself so that all team members are feeling okay, because it's hard work parenting, and parenting a child who's struggling is even harder. So I will get into it then. So today, oh, sorry, I have to, all right. If you could bear with me for one brief moment because my view, okay, there we go. Sorry, okay. So today I'm going to talk about how stress impacts our physical and emotional well-being. I'm going to look at the stress associated with caregiving. I'm going to talk about why it's important to manage stress. And then I'm going to talk about strategies to empty your basket, which will make sense when I get to that. So I'm going to talk about self-care. And then I'm going to wrap up with a helpful tool that you can use to help your child cope with stress. Because I know that although you attended this talk to learn more about self-care, I wanted to be able to provide you something that you can do to support your loved one, because I know having those tools is also really helpful for your own well-being. Because we don't have a ton of time together and I got a bit carried away with a lot of information, I'm only going over these topics briefly, but I've included a lot of links and resources in the slide deck in case you wanted to take a deeper dive. And we will be sending out these slides to you after the talk so that you'll have them to refer back to. So because of that, some slides have a lot of text on them. It's because I wanted you to be able to look back and know what was discussed. So that is the overview. So let's talk about caregiving. Parenting or caregiving can be one of the most rewarding and exciting experiences, and it could also be one of the most stressful, difficult, and anxiety-inducing experiences too. Stress is normal and an actually necessary part of being a parent. Stress can motivate us and enables us to adapt to new, difficult, or unexpected situations and to react to potential threat or danger. It can also take a toll, though, on us physically and emotionally, and could potentially interfere with our parenting or our ability to function day to day. And although we know all of the tasks involved in being a caregiver can create stress, research has demonstrated that certain situations can be especially stressful for caregivers, and they make them more susceptible to excessive stress. So specifically, situations like having at least one child with a difficult temperament, having at least one child with medical, emotional, or behavior problems, having low levels of social support, being a single parent, and having a young child. All of those have been shown to increase stress levels in caregivers. And most, if not all of you, are here today because you're coping with at least one of these situations, specifically supporting a child who might be struggling with their mental health. So I'm going to briefly go over the stress response to demonstrate what happens in our brain and body when we experience stress. So our stress response begins and ends in the brain. Our brain is wired for survival. So it's wired to perceive threat and then sound an alarm, which triggers a well-orchestrated series of events, including a release of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. And we have physiological responses as well, such as increased heart rate, rapid breathing, and so on. And this combination of reactions to stress is also known as the fight or flight response, because it really evolved as a survival mechanism, enabling people and other mammals to react quickly to life-threatening situations. The near instantaneous sequence of hormonal changes and physiological responses helps someone to fight the threat off or flee to safety. The reaction is not intentional. It happens automatically, and our higher order thinking and reasoning actually goes offline temporarily, and our lower brain takes over, the survival part of our brain, and does what it needs for us to fight or flee. And once the initial response occurs, our stress response system then also can adjust depending on whether we need to press on the gas and stay revved up and on high alert, or whether we need to put on the brake and dampen the stress response. And although our stress response system is quite remarkable and intricate, it unfortunately is not always accurate to what kind of threat it's reacting to. So our stress response can be activated by stressors that are not life-threatening, like traffic jams, work pressure, interpersonal difficulties, family stress, in much the same way that it might react if a lion was bursting through the door. And this is all automatic. It happens before our thinking brain has time to rationally and calmly reflect and adjust the response. So the example I like to give, if we were in person right now, and I were to kind of throw a pen at one of you, you would likely move out of the way before your higher level part of your brain has a chance to think, why is she throwing something at me? You would react before you interpreted what exactly was happening. And that's because we jump into action automatically. People differ in how sensitive their stress response system is to their environment. And although we all come wired into the world in a certain way, some people are wired as more sensitive to their environments, but our life experiences can also affect our stress response system. So for example, we know that people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences can have very sensitive stress response systems that can sound the alarm more easily and more often. And in addition, for some people, in response to stress, their brain might not be as quick to put on the brake and dampen the stress response, so they might stay revved up for longer. And research has shown that chronic low-level stress can keep our stress response activated, much like a car engine that's left idling on high for too long. So after a while, as you can imagine, this can have an impact on our health and well-being. And when stress hormones remain elevated over long periods of time, they produce wear and tear on the brain and our biological systems, which really weren't designed to operate under constantly stressful conditions. So if our cortisol levels remain high for too long of a period of time, the brain and body make adaptations to try to achieve balance in the system. And this then affects how our system regulates our stress response. So our brain becomes less sensitive to the signals, and it can be harder to shut down our stress response over time. I just want to highlight, though, not all stress is bad. So positive stress is stress we experience when we're excited or nervous. So our heart rate might go up. We might start to sweat briefly. So some examples of positive stress might be starting a new job or planning for a wedding or preparing for a trip. Another type of stress that we experience is called tolerable stress. And tolerable stress activates the body's alert system to a greater degree as a result of more severe or longer lasting difficulties. So tolerable stress is stress experienced during a challenging time and generally goes away once the event that triggered it is over. So we might experience tolerable stress from things like an important project at work or moving to a new home, or more difficult situations like the loss of a loved one or a natural disaster. And tolerable stress requires us to use some of our coping strategies in order to manage this stress, but it's time limited. And if we buffer ourselves with supportive relationships and adaptive coping, this type of stress does not have a long-term impact on our health and well-being. Toxic stress is the most difficult type of stress and is long-lasting. Toxic stress occurs when we experience strong, frequent, and/or long-lasting difficult events that exceed our ability to cope or our ability to buffer ourselves to bring our stress level down. It's when our body stays in stress mode for extended periods of time with limited breaks. And toxic stress has the potential to have serious negative effects on our physical and mental health. So whether stress is tolerable or toxic depends on the nature of the stress. So for example, we know certain situations such as intimate partner violence, chronic racism, or living in poverty can be a source of toxic stress, but other stressors can also have toxic effects, especially if we have multiple sources of stress that are long-lasting, and if we're not able to adaptively cope and buffer ourselves with supportive relationships and other coping mechanisms to help our body shut off the stress response. So aside from the daily stresses associated with being a caregiver, even when our kids are not struggling, caregiving for a child who's struggling with their mental health can add some additional stressors. And this list is not exhaustive, and I'm sure if I asked you all, you could probably add a lengthy list of other stressors, but I thought it would be helpful to highlight a few here. So when a child, or an adult for that matter, struggles with their mental health, they often experience distress. And human beings are wired to feel stress when we hear others in distress. It serves an important biological function because it ensures that when we hear a baby cry, we're motivated to take action to reduce their distress and care for them. So this ensures on a biological level that we remain motivated to care for our young. And there's been plenty of research to show that when we hear babies cry, even if it's not our own baby, our body's stress response system automatically kicks in, even if it's not our child. So as a parent whose child is struggling with their mental health, you've likely seen your child in various states of distress more often than a child who's not struggling. This means that your stress response is being triggered quite frequently. So that just your child being in distress can trigger your stress response. Never mind all the other stressors of caring for a child who's struggling. So for example, getting through routines. We know when kids struggle with their mental health, it can impact their daily functioning. They might struggle with getting through their routines and activities. Waking up and getting ready for school can be a challenge. Simple requests like asking them to brush their teeth can become an exhausting battle. Getting to bed on time, and so on. This all adds stress to you as a caregiver throughout the day. And in addition to just the stresses of daily life, there's also the stress of just navigating various systems. If your child's challenges make school difficult, you might have to navigate the school system, such as getting your child extra support or advocating for resources. And as we know, getting mental health supports can also be a challenge. So you might have had to navigate the children's mental health system only to be met with long wait times. Navigating all of these systems can be an additional source of stress and frustration. Also, often caregivers whose children struggle with their mental health report feeling very isolated. They might find going out and socializing with their child too challenging, and instead they withdraw or isolate and therefore don't have the social supports that they so desperately need. Or their kids might be struggling and they have to contend with a lot of well-intentioned family and friends offering advice and suggestions that might not be helpful, or might in fact be counter to what your child needs. This can also cause a lot of confusion, frustration, and worry, and might also get you to kind of not be so quick to go socialize with your social supports. And if you have more than one child, you might struggle with the stress of trying to ensure that you're providing attention and support to your other children, and then feel guilty for having less time for them. If your child's challenges interfere with their daily functioning and ability to manage at school, you might be impacted at work with frequent calls or absences, which can add another layer of stress. And finally, when we're stressed, our sleep can be greatly impacted, and perhaps you're not able to sleep because you spend time worrying or ruminating about your child. Or perhaps you spend so much time supporting your child that you sacrifice sleep to get things done around the house late at night. Whatever the reason, lack of sleep is actually a stressor because it wears down our body and brain and makes it harder to function day to day. And as I said, this list is not exhaustive. It's meant to highlight some of the additional caregiving stressors that you might be experiencing related to your child's mental health challenges. So if I haven't sold you on the importance of self-care based on the toll that it can take on your brain and body, hopefully I could convince you based on the impact that chronic stress can take on your ability to support your child. What we know is that children need supportive, responsive, caring relationships in order to thrive. When a child is struggling with their mental health, we know that caregivers play an essential role in helping them develop healthy and effective tools to regulate their emotions and cope with their challenges. The human brain is actually not fully developed until age 25. So what that means is kids don't have a fully developed brain, and they're not able to independently manage and cope with stress on their own. they necessarily require adults who are able to guide them through this process. And adults who can hold those big feelings and help their child by co-regulating their emotions. So they need adults who are calm, grounded, and patient. However, it is almost impossible for us to remain calm, grounded, and patient when we experience chronic stress. In fact, chronic stress, especially stress related to caregiving for a child or adult who's struggling, can actually trigger in us a biological reaction that interferes with our ability to provide helpful care to our child. So this biological reaction is a concept called blocked care. And it comes from Dr. Dan Hughes, who's a psychologist in the US, who's worked extensively with kids who have experienced trauma and attachment disruptions and complex mental health challenges. And although the concept was developed to explain what happens to caregivers who are caring for kids who have experienced trauma, I really think it applies to any caregiver who's caring for someone who's struggling with their emotions and behaviors, because depending on the child's struggles, the challenges for caregivers are similar. So because we have limited time together, I'm only going to briefly explain the concept, but at the end of the presentation, I have some more links if you want to read more about blocked care. But keep in mind, the literature really focuses on adoptive or foster caregivers who are caring for kids who've experienced trauma, but it can equally apply to any parent who is parenting a child that's struggling. So the idea is that when kids struggle with their feelings or behaviors, as their caregiver, we try everything in our toolbox to help support them. However, it might seem like nothing we do works to keep their stress response consistently calm. No matter what we try, we inevitably encounter repeated challenges. And this prolonged stress can take a toll and contribute to a whole host of difficult feelings like self-doubt, shame, powerlessness, feeling ineffective, feeling hopeless and helpless. The prolonged stress can trigger our stress response or our survival brain into action. And if the stress is chronic and we don't have adaptive ways to manage it, the stress response doesn't turn off. When we're in survival brain, as I mentioned earlier, our automatic behaviors take over. We go into autopilot and the more rational thinking part of our brain shuts off or is harder to access. So we operate in a more self-protective, self-defense mode, and we develop a self-protective stance towards our child. This happens almost instinctively as a way of protecting ourselves from the chronic stress. So this reaction of being in self-protective mode actually makes sense on a neurobiological level, and I think it's helpful to understand what's going on for us so that we could be mindful of this and use strategies to help mitigate the impact. So when kids, or adults for that matter, resist our attempts to connect, or when we interpret ourselves as ineffective in a relationship, it makes sense that it would then be hard for us to remain open and engaged. Because parenting or caregiving is hard work, having a reciprocal and pleasurable experience with our kids helps us to keep going. And when faced repeatedly with interactions where we feel ineffective or we perceive the other person as rejecting our efforts, whether it's passively through avoidance or resistance or actively with anger and outbursts, our own brains, which are also wired for survival, will start to protect us from the social rejection that we experience. And we develop strategies to protect ourselves from the pain. This is not conscious. It happens automatically as a survival strategy. So our ability to care for our child essentially becomes blocked. So blocked care refers to a scenario in which too much stress suppresses our higher brain functioning needed for caregiving, and we adopt a self-defensive stance towards our child. So in blocked care, our nurturing capacities are suppressed and temporarily out of commission. We tend to become more reactive and just respond to problems rather than to our child's emotional state. And our attention kind of gets pulled towards the more negative parts of our child. And obviously this can have a negative impact on our parenting because it can contribute to difficulty maintaining positive, reciprocal, and satisfying interactions with our child. So some signs we might be in blocked care include we might frequently overreact to our child's challenging behavior, seeing the behavior as the child doing things on purpose or choosing to deliberately behave in a particular way. We might view the child's emotions and behaviors as personal, such as rejection or a lack of gratitude. although we might be well-meaning and of course love our child, we might become stuck in a cycle of judgment towards them and begin to question our capacity to care for them. We might feel defensive and find ourselves being more guarded to protect ourselves from rejection. We might feel burned out, chronically overwhelmed, or fatigued. We might be aware that we're meeting our child's practical needs, but we don't feel any real pleasure in parenting. We might find it difficult to think about different ways of being with our child and feel stuck with one way of doing things and find it hard to keep an open mind. We might become irritable with our partner or other family members, or we might feel cynical about our situation or the help being offered by our support network. We might find it hard to tap into feelings of compassion or nurture, and then we feel guilty about this, or we might just generally feel shut down. So these are really difficult things to experience. And the reason I'm mentioning them here and the important point I want to highlight is that if you are experiencing any of these things, it's completely understandable. And it's a neurobiological reaction to experiences of chronic and prolonged interpersonal stress. It's a result of our brain's wiring to protect us from pain. And I know a lot of parents have a hard time feeling comfortable to share some of these feelings because they feel guilt about it. They feel shame. They feel, why am I feeling this? Am I a bad parent? And the message I want you to take home is this is normal and understandable because this is what happens when our body is chronically stressed. So I think it's important for us to understand what's happening in our brains and bodies when we're stressed so that we can learn and implement strategies to calm our stress response so that we don't find ourselves in blocked care. So even if we're not at the point of being in blocked care, based on all the stresses associated with caregiving that I've just discussed, I want to highlight that parenting or caregiving is emotional labor. It's a never-ending job where our stress response system is constantly activated. And as we've just discussed, there's a cumulative impact of our stress response system being activated. If our stress response system is activated continuously, without putting in place buffers to calm down our brain and body, we can experience serious impacts to our physical and mental well-being, and extreme cases, it could bring us into blocked care. The great news is that with practice, we could actually manually override the controls and put the brakes on our stress response system through some of the strategies I'm going to discuss today. And although no coping or self-care strategy is going to take away the stress you're experiencing, the goal is not actually to take away the stress, but rather to keep it in a range that's tolerable. We want to try to buffer ourselves from the harmful impacts of stress by finding ways to calm our stress response system so that it's not constantly firing. So how do we do this, you might ask? We need to empty our baskets. So let me explain, because this is an analogy that I overuse, but I love it. So providing care to kids who are struggling with their mental health can be challenging and draining because we're dealing with the intense emotions and behaviors. And so I'd like to explain it using a basket analogy that I once heard. So specifically, all kids have very small emotional baskets, and stresses and emotional arousal go into their basket. And because they have limited strategies to empty their basket can easily overflow. And it's the job of the adult in a child's life to have a bigger basket and catch the overflow, because this helps kids learn to regulate their big feelings. When an adult can catch the emotions and help kids empty their baskets, they eventually learn how to do that for themselves. However, catching the overflow of kids who have mental health challenges can be really hard because sometimes instead of a basket, they have more of a thimble with many little holes in it, and the feelings go in and just ooze out everywhere. And of course, this is really stressful for any of the adults caring for these kids. So it's so important for us to also ensure that we're emptying our baskets, because even though our baskets are bigger than our child, our baskets can also get full and overflow. And when that happens, it makes it almost impossible to catch our child's overflow and provide the support they need to empty their basket. So we need to constantly attend to our basket and ensure that we're able to empty it in healthy and adaptive ways. So there are ways for us to empty our baskets so that we can prevent blocked care. First and foremost, we need to do everything we can to avoid personalizing our child's behaviors And we need to remember that they're struggling and they are in survival brain themselves. Their behaviors are not intentional or willful. They are in the downstairs part of their brain as well. We can be prepared and anticipate challenges and reactions ahead of time so that we adopt a mindset that this is the child's survival brain and can plan ahead for how we can handle a situation and how we could remain calm. Perhaps most importantly, we need to have a solid support system that provides reciprocity, acceptance, and understanding, and who could catch our overflow. So we need to ensure that we have adequate social supports. So for example, supportive family or friends or a professional or a support group, much like through Parents for Children's Mental Health. We need to engage in self-care activities that help reduce our stress, and we need to practice our own emotion regulation strategies. And I really want to emphasize, this is not a luxury. Taking care of ourselves and making sure that we are well regulated and that our stress is managed is the most important strategies to support someone who's struggling with their mental health. You're not being selfish to meet your own needs. In fact, it's one of the best things you can do for your child because their ability to regulate their emotions will depend on how well you're able to regulate yours when you interact with them when they're struggling. And that is a very, very hard thing to do because, as we said, when we see someone else in distress, our own stress response system gets triggered. So there's many small ways to de-stress and support yourself. So don't assume you need to do a huge change. Just start by putting yourself back on your own list. So nurture yourself in small ways throughout the day, including while you nurture your child. And one of the biggest barriers to self-care that I often hear is time. As caregivers, you're stretched so thin that there never seems to be time to focus on yourself. However, the truth is, self-care doesn't need to be done all at once. In fact, waiting for your basket to get full before you empty it can be problematic because it means the stress has been piling up. Instead, try small doses of self-care throughout the day. And research has shown that small doses can actually be just as effective, if not more effective, than to keep your basket from overflowing. So what this means is rather than trying to carve out hours for self-care, break it down into bite-sized moments that fit seamlessly into your routine. So whether you have 3 minutes while waiting for the kettle to boil or 10 minutes before a doctor's appointment, these tiny moments can become powerful tools for emptying your basket. And this allows you to weave in moments of well-being into your busy schedule without adding additional pressure. So these small practices can actually have a profound impact on your physical, emotional, and mental health. And by nurturing yourself in small doses, you're not only caring for your own well-being, but also enhancing your ability to provide compassionate care to your loved ones. So without further rambling from me, I'm going to move into some strategies that can help you empty your basket. And I'm just going to take a sip of water while I do that. So well-being is a broad concept that's impacted by many different dimensions in our lives. So we know that our mental and emotional health are also tied to our physical health and vice versa. And there's a number of different models with different numbers of dimensions that contribute to well-being. I chose this particular model because I think it captures some key areas that you could attend to when you're finding ways to empty your basket. I do want to highlight, though, there's no one-size-fits-all way to self-care. You'll need to determine what works for you, but it's helpful to consider these different domains of your life, including your physical and psychological health, emotional and spiritual needs, and your relationships. And all of these areas are interconnected. And so this kind of reminds us of different areas where we could implement strategies to cope with our stress. So mental well-being is kind of the cognitive aspects of health, so our thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. Our emotional well-being is our mood and general emotional state, our ability to recognize and express our feelings. Spiritual well-being relates to our sense of overall purpose in life. So people often find this purpose from a belief or faith system, while others create their own purpose. And having a sense of purpose or meaning can help enhance our sense of well-being and can help us to maintain a proper perspective on life and cope with adversity. The social dimension refers to our ability to make and maintain meaningful relationships with others and to have social supports. And our physical well-being is our biological functions. So our physical health, sleep, appetite, energy level. And we also know that connection to our culture and our community is also an essential part of well-being and is really tied to our identity and provides a sense of belonging. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to go over some suggested activities for each area of well-being. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to go through some of these quickly because some are likely things you've heard before. And I really want to focus more on the mental and emotional well-being components, but also because I wanted to give you the information, but then I have lots of resources if you want to take a deeper dive, if there's something of interest to you. Okay, and then I'll just briefly say, some people find it helpful to start managing their stress to first kind of figure out what's going on. And so, as I mentioned earlier, caregiving or parenting, it's hard work, even more so when our kids are struggling. So our bodies are producing more stress hormones because we're in a challenging situation. So we really need to acknowledge and validate that and not try to minimize or dismiss our stress or expect that we shouldn't be impacted. The situation is challenging and it is stressful, and it's natural and okay to feel whatever we are feeling. So the first step of coping and emptying our basket is to be aware of our stressors and how it's impacting us. We also need to be aware of and acknowledge our own internal experience and needs, and to make a commitment to ourselves that we're going to actively focus on our self-care. So some people find it helpful to make a plan or a roadmap. So you consider how stress is impacting each dimension. So how is it impacting our body, like our sleep, our energy? How is it impacting our thinking, our mood? And once we know how it's impacting us, we could then move on to step 2, which is creating a resilience roadmap. So we consider all of the different dimensions of wellness and think of what we could do in each area, but being realistic. We don't need to include huge or time-consuming strategies. It's small things that we could incorporate into our daily routine. And in fact, as I mentioned before, there is some research that small, like 5-minute, but regular doses of self-care activities, so things like deep breathing, which I will talk about, or mindfulness or exercise, can be just as beneficial as longer activities. And I remember that during the pandemic, I was not only swamped at work, but we had such limits on our typical self-care activities because of the lockdowns. And so I would spend whatever free moments I had doom scrolling on social media, looking for updates, or I would see people post things about how much fun they were having during lockdowns. And I started feeling bad because I was not having fun. And I was finding that all my spare time was consumed with this heaviness. And I would feel the stress inside my body. And it just had such an impact on my mood. And when I started to notice myself like really feeling not happy, stressed, anxious, and I was carrying around with it all day, I decided I was going to start by making small changes. And I'm sharing this, it might sound ridiculous. And if we were in person, someone might try to throw something saying, Wendy, how are you going to get me to reduce my stress by this? But I will tell you, I made a conscious choice when I was scrolling to look up videos of puppies. It seems silly. It seems like, how is that going to help me empty my basket? I have to tell you though, once I started scrolling through like cute little puppy videos, it actually sends a response to your brain. It releases brain chemicals. So all those stressful things I was reading, like the doom scrolling, those were actually making my brain's alarm go off. When I was looking at puppy pictures, it was putting the brakes on my stress response. And so little small changes to things you're already doing can actually have a huge impact on your mood. So that is why I shared that story. But it's the accumulation of these small little things that can actually make a big difference in how we cope. So we're emptying our basket a little bit at a time, but that's just as effective, if not more, as emptying it all at once, because it prevents it from building up and overflowing. So it's often helpful to start and think of what's worked for you in the past when you are feeling stress and consider if any of those strategies would be helpful now. And then you could start to add some new strategies in. So then the next step is to think of possible obstacles, things that might get in your way. Like, for example, if you have back-to-back meetings, problem solve around that. Then implement your plan, practice every day. Make sure to check in to make sure your plan is working for you and see if you need to tweak anything, and then revise your plan as needed. And I've included planning sheets at the end of the whole self-care section. So if you find those helpful. Okay, so let's move into physical well-being. So I said, I'm going to go through this briefly, but typically when we think of coping or managing with stress, we often think of more of the psychological strategies like emotional or cognitive coping. And those are, of course, important, but it's equally as important to attend to our physical well-being because we know stress can have a huge impact. And I often find the physical well-being strategies are brushed over. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight a few here. And I've provided additional resources if you want to take a deeper dive. But what I wanted to share is when our body's stress response is triggered, the hormone epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, is released into our bloodstream. And as it circulates through our body, it brings about a number of physiological changes. So our heart beats faster than normal. It pushes blood to our muscles, our heart, and other vital organs. Our pulse rate and blood pressure go up. And chronic low-level stress can keep our stress system activated, much like a motor that's idling on high for too long. And this can contribute to a host of health problems. So stress can lead to changes in sleep, appetite, headaches, stomach aches, bowel changes, spikes in blood pressure. So in order to cope with stress and get back into the range we could tolerate, we really do need to focus on our physical well-being. So many of the suggestions I have actually can help lower our body's stress response. So one really important area is sleep hygiene. As we know, sleep is essential for both our physical as well as our mental health and well-being. And it's one area where stress can have a huge impact. So it can impact our ability to fall asleep, to stay asleep, or feel well rested. So practicing good sleep hygiene is really essential when we're under conditions of chronic stress. So things like setting a consistent sleep schedule, going to sleep and waking up at the same time each day, the consistency is so important to train your brain to regulate its sleep or wake cycle. If you can't sleep, get up and do something calming and then try again. Try to avoid caffeine, alcohol, or nicotine for 4 to 6 hours before bed. Avoid napping so that you could ensure you're tired when it's time for bed. Create a relaxing bedtime routine or ritual like listening to calming music, stretching, meditation. If possible, keep your bed for sleeping. Don't work, read, or watch TV in bed. In this way, your brain learns to associate the bed with sleeping only. Reduce screen time before bed, if possible, 2 hours before, but otherwise at least 30 to 60 minutes, because electronic devices can suppress melatonin and make it more difficult to sleep. Try turning the clock around so you're not obsessing over how much sleep you're getting. Frequently checking the clock during the night can actually increase anxiety, making it harder to sleep. And at the end of this section, I've actually included more resources about sleep, and there's even a free program based in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that I've included a link for if sleep is something that you're struggling with. I'll briefly, just because I'm mindful of the time and I have a lot of information to share, but briefly wanted to mention nutrition because that actually is very much linked to our mental and emotional well-being. So ensure that you're eating regularly, including protein, so that you're keeping your blood sugar steady throughout the day. Fluctuations in our blood sugar levels can affect our mood. Drink plenty of water. Even mild dehydration has been shown to affect mood. Be sure to include healthy and well-balanced meals to increase energy levels. Eating high-quality foods that contain lots of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants actually nourishes the brain. And I'm not going to go into all of that here, but if you want to take a deeper dive into how these foods are related to well-being and mood, please see the resources at the end of this section, because there's a whole growing field of nutritional psychiatry, which really focuses on dietary modifications that can help impact our mental health. Limit or avoid alcohol and caffeine because both can interfere with sleep. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to say about physical well-being, we know that exercise is considered vital in reducing our stress, and studies have shown that it's very effective at reducing fatigue, improving alertness and concentration, and enhancing our overall cognitive function. And this can be especially helpful when stress has depleted our energy or ability to concentrate. So regular participation in aerobic exercise has been shown to decrease overall levels of tension, elevate and stabilize our mood, improve our sleep, and improve our self-esteem. Even 5 minutes of aerobic exercise can actually stimulate anti-anxiety effects. And there's actually research to suggest that regular exercise can treat mild to moderate depression as effectively as antidepressant medication. And exercise does not need to be strenuous. Modest amounts of exercise, including low intensity activities like going for a walk, sustained over time, is also very helpful. So in our busy schedules, it can seem sometimes like there's no time to devote to exercise, but what's more important than exercising all at once is ensuring regular movement breaks multiple times a day. So even brief bouts of activity offer benefits. And research has shown that within 5 minutes after moderate exercise, you actually get a mood enhancing effect. So for example, if you can't fit in a 30-minute walk, try 3 10-minute walks, or interval training, which entails brief, like 60 to 90-second burst of intense activity at almost full effort, has been shown to be safe, effective, and efficient way of gaining the benefits of exercise. And if you don't have time to go for a walk, think of ways you can add some extra steps into what you're already doing. So for example, when parking at the grocery store, or if you have to go to the mall, instead of finding the closest parking spot, park the furthest away to get in some extra movements. Or if your house has 2 floors and you have to use the washroom, try using the washroom on another floor just to add in those extra steps. Or see if you can add movement breaks and get your kids involved. So turn on music and have a dance party, race them to the car. Any opportunity that you could build in those little bursts of movement, over time, it's going to have a big impact on your mental health and well-being. And what's important is just making it part of your lifestyle. And perhaps the easiest way to take care of our physical well-being and help empty our basket is to do something you're already doing, which is breathing. So I struggled with which dimension to put this because it's part of coping with emotions as well, but it's a biological function, so I put it here. And deep breathing is one of the best ways to lower stress in our body. And that's because when you breathe in deeply, it sends a message to your brain to calm down and relax. The brain sends that message to your body. So those things that happen when you're stressed, like increased heart rate, fast breathing, high blood pressure, all decrease as you breathe deeply to relax. So the way you breathe affects your whole body, and breathing exercises are a great way to relax, reduce tension, and relieve stress. And it also allows more carbon dioxide to enter the blood, which quiets down parts of our brain, like our amygdala, that handles our anxiety response. So breathing exercises are really easy to learn. You could do them whenever you want, and you can do different exercises to see what works best for you. And as I said, I included some links for that. But it's recommended to do them regularly during the day. So during breaks or at moments of transition between 2 activities. So you simply stop, adjust your posture, and allow yourself to breathe for a few minutes. And one helpful strategy that I'm sharing here is the 365 method. So doing it 3 times a day, breathing at a rhythm of 6 cycles per minute. So 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out for 5 minutes. And you do that every day, 365 days a year. And the final coping tool related to physical health is progressive muscle relaxation. And so as I kind of already mentioned, our body reacts to stress with muscle tension, which can cause pain and discomfort. And that in turn tells the body that we're stressed. So it kind of keeps the cycle of stress going. And progressive muscle relaxation can help break this cycle by reducing our muscle tension and our general mental anxiety. And this can help people get to sleep. And there's a ton of research showing that it's effective. I do want to say it's effective for most people. Those with a history of psychosis or those who dissociate should not engage in progressive muscle relaxation without first speaking with a mental health care provider. But the idea behind progressive muscle relaxation is you create tension in different muscle groups for 5 to 10 seconds, and then you let it go. And you're comparing the difference between a tensed muscle and a relaxed muscle. And you do that for 10 to 20 seconds, you hold it and you let go. And this procedure, and you work from your feet all the way up to your head. And that creating tension and then releasing it causes your body to become more relaxed. And both progressive muscle relaxation and breathing exercises, used alone or in combination, are forms of self-regulation that help decrease our sympathetic arousal to promote comfort. And I'm not going to walk you through progressive muscle relaxation today because this is not a voice of relaxation, but there are tons of resources online with scripts, and I have resources here for you if you are interested in learning more. Okay, so I'm going to talk about emotional well-being. So emotions serve an essential and necessary biological function by motivating our behavior, helping us communicate with others, and by alerting us to things in our environment that are beneficial or potentially problematic. So it's really a way to signal to us that some action is needed. So for example, the experience of fear lets us know that we need to fight or flee. The experience of sadness mobilizes us towards self-care and signals to us that we need to connect with others. The experience of anger attempts to keep danger at a distance and signals the need to set a boundary. Guilt signals that we're not behaving according to our values, so it signals an internal threat and motivates us to repair. The goal of coping with emotions is not to get rid of unpleasant feelings. We need to experience our emotions. Rather, coping with emotions is really about learning to bring down the intensity of the emotion so that we could tolerate it. The actions we take to meet our needs don't necessarily make the feeling go away instantly. What they do is they help bring the feeling into a tolerable range so we could tolerate and cope with it. And unfortunately, much of modern Western society does not encourage a tolerance for discomfort. We have a misconception that emotional well-being means feeling good all the time. And so we often try to avoid negative feelings or mask them. So we say things to kids like, don't cry, don't be sad. And we often want to try to protect kids from negative feelings. So we jump into problem solve or shelter them from sadness or disappointment. The idea that somehow feeling sad, anxious, or angry, the so-called negative emotions, is bad, is problematic because it contributes to our feelings of stress and interferes with enhancing our resilience. The fact is, emotional well-being is about being able to accept, regulate, and tolerate our feelings. We need to learn to tolerate and accept our emotions, even if they're unpleasant, because they serve an important biological function. So we'll just briefly go over this for the sake of time, but I mentioned earlier that being a caregiver is hard enough, even when our kids are not struggling, but caregiving for a child who's struggling with their mental health can be stressful and bring about many different feelings. So for example, research has found that feelings like anxiety, sadness, helplessness, shame, guilt, frustration, embarrassment, grief, are often experienced by parents whose children are diagnosed with a mental health disorder. So for example, they might feel helpless in supporting their child who's struggling. They might feel helpless to stop their child from being ostracized or excluded at school. They may feel sad that their child is struggling. They may feel sad that they have a child who's struggling and then feel guilt about that. So there's a whole host of emotions. And the reason I'm kind of showing many of them here is because I really want to highlight that whatever you are feeling in your situation is normal and understandable. Parenting a child who is struggling is stressful and can trigger all different types of feelings. And it's so important to acknowledge and understand what you are feeling, because as I said earlier, our feelings signal to us a need, and we need to know what we're feeling so we can know how to meet that need. But identifying our feelings is not always actually as easy as we might think. We often don't stop to reflect on the emotion. We're just aware of like the physiological arousal that accompanies the feeling, like muscle tension or fatigue. And so sometimes if we're struggling with identifying or managing our emotions, it could be because we've not yet actually identified what our primary emotion is that is contributing to our distress. So primary emotions are direct emotional reactions to a situation, and they're called primary because they come first. So it's your very first reaction to a situation or event, and they alert you about your needs. So a typical example would be if you get angry as a result of someone verbally attacking someone you love, and you feel a need to protect that person or set boundaries. The feeling of anger would be a primary emotion in that situation because it's signaling to you a need and helps you protect what's important to you by making you more likely to assert yourself. However, we don't always know or show what we feel. So we might experience unwanted feelings or feelings that we have learned are not okay to express. And this is where we encounter our secondary emotions. A secondary emotion is our emotional response to our primary emotion. So it's really what you feel about what you're feeling. So secondary emotions are informed by our beliefs, our caregivers, our societal expectations, personal history, past experiences. So for example, if someone who is important to you says something hurtful to you, you might become sad. So that would be your primary emotion. But if experiencing for sadness for some reason is difficult for you, you might also notice that you get anger. The anger is your secondary reaction because it's a reaction to your sadness. It's protecting you from that feeling of vulnerability. So based on gender stereotypes and messages often conveyed to men and women, there's a tendency in our society for men to show anger when they're experiencing more vulnerable feelings like sadness or shame. And there's a tendency for women to show sadness or guilt when they're experiencing anger. And this comes from like conditioning we've had. So when our focus is on our secondary emotions rather than our primary emotions, it can sometimes intensify what we're feeling. So example I like to give is if a parent's angry at their child because she ran into the busy street and they yell at her, it might help in the moment to scare her back to safety, but if they stay angry, it would actually damage the relationship. Instead, if they can identify the underlying primary emotion, in this case, it would be fear, they can meet the child from a more loving place of, I was afraid when you did that, versus the angry place of, what were you thinking? So like knowing what is underlying the emotion is so important. And secondary emotions aren't helpful because they cover up what you really feel and can send confusing signals to the outside world about what you need. So for example, if you're sad and need support, but you signal anger, that's telling others they should stay away. So if you have a strong emotional response and it doesn't go away, it might sometimes be worth it to take another look and ask, what am I truly feeling right now? And once you could identify what you're feeling, you can either take steps to address your need, or you could engage in steps to tolerate and decrease the intensity of the feelings. And as caregivers, it's really important to be aware of our primary and secondary emotions with respect to our own reaction to our children. So for example, we might find ourselves feeling angry or impatient with our child when they're having some big feelings or behaviors. But if we take time to reflect on that, it might actually be that we feel anxious or we have thoughts of self-doubt about our ability to protect them. And that anger is really our response to our self-doubt rather than anger at our child. So this kind of self-reflection is really important and can help us know what steps we need to take to help with our own self-care and well-being. And I found this graphic. You'll notice I have a lot of graphics in here because I find ones that I love and I'm like, I have to put this in. So this does a nice job of things we could say to ourselves to start to acknowledge and accept our feelings. So for example, instead of saying to ourselves, there's no reason for me to feel this way, telling ourselves there's a reason for every feeling. My feelings about this situation are wrong. We could tell ourselves there's no wrong or right ways to feel. Instead of saying I shouldn't feel this way, we can tell ourselves I do feel this way and that's okay. Instead of telling ourselves I'm too old to be getting upset about this, I can be upset at any age, or I need to stop feeling this way. Maybe I could make room for this feeling. And there's a great workbook that I've linked on the bottom here, and it's also in the resource page. It was to help people cope during the COVID pandemic, but it has a great section on emotion identification and regulation, which outlines the following steps. So the first step is to notice or observe. So recall a time you were last experiencing a strong emotion. What physical sensation did you experience? Label the emotion. What is it? What sensation does it fit with? And then step 3 is to adopt or allow it. Can I accept this emotion? Can I accept that I'm feeling frustrated with my child? Or can I accept that I'm feeling embarrassed or whatever the feeling is? And then step 4 is to meet the need. What need is the emotion alerting to you to? So for example, anxiety is alerting you to the need of reassurance or safety. Sadness usually pulls us to need solace or comfort. Anger usually signals a boundary is needed or someone's violated a boundary or we need to be assertive. Guilt signals relationship repair. And then what do you need to do to fulfill that need? And remember, meeting the need might not take the feeling away, but the goal is to bring down the intensity of your emotions so that it's tolerable. And then I included these great little graphics here that go through other emotions and what need they're signaling. So I will leave that to you to look through when you get the slides. And the final strategy I wanted to share with you for emotional well-being is self-soothing. And it would be wonderful if when we're upset, someone could swoop in and comfort us like we do for our children. But as we know, as caregivers, we often have to be able to do this for ourselves in the moment. So self-soothing really has to do with comforting, nurturing, and being gentle and kind to ourselves. And it's really a way to help bring down the intensity of our emotions by providing comfort to ourselves. And although social support is a huge part of coping, we can't be 100% dependent on it because there's times where our emotions are heightened in the moment and we need strategies to bring the temperature down on our own. So the reason self-soothing strategies work, it actually goes back to the brain. Kind of when I was telling you about those puppy pictures, it signals the calming parts of our brain. And so when our brain is in fight or flight mode, we need something to kind of shut that off and put the brakes on. So a self-soothing activity is any activity that helps calm or relieve some of your stress, some of your distress. And it's usually the 5 senses that we use for this purpose. And there's really very few steps to this. All you need to do is be present, focus on your senses, and allow yourself to be fully immersed in the sensory experience. So self-soothing strategies come in many forms. It's often helpful to compile a list. You don't have to wait to be stressed to practice it. Doing it in doses is so helpful. And there's things you could do to empty your basket that don't take a lot of time. So for example, putting on your favorite music while cooking or cleaning or doing chores and really being absorbed in it. Lighting a scented candle while you're folding laundry that provides a comforting smell. Sipping on your favorite tea while doing carpool. It's these small little things that you're doing to nurture yourself that help to empty your basket so that your basket isn't getting too full. So every little thing you do for self-care helps to decrease the stress and kind of chip away at emptying the basket. That was an image of a bucket coming out. The key is to be present. So pay attention to how the candle smells or the music sounds or the tea tastes. And I just want to remind you, none of this is going to happen at once. So it's those doses that are so important to prevent your basket from overflowing. And here are a bunch of resources for you. And so I'm going to get into mental well-being, which focuses on how we think, learn, reason, and problem solve. And if I had more time, I'd actually focus here on elements of cognitive behavioral therapy, which teaches us how to kind of look at our thoughts and what we're thinking, but we don't have time for that. However, in the resource section, I do include ways to access free cognitive behavioral therapy if you think that's something you could benefit from. But for now, I'm going to highlight a couple of other strategies that can help you empty your basket. So one tool that can help with our mental well-being is the idea of building mastery. So when we're stressed and overwhelmed and we're doing so many things at once, it's easy to feel like we aren't doing anything well. And this is especially true when it comes to caregiving, especially for a child who's struggling. So you're doing everything you can to support your child, and yet they still seem to struggle. And when we're overwhelmed, we tend to focus on the negative and don't feel very confident, which could contribute to increased feelings of stress and low mood. So building mastery is a skill that helps you feel a sense of confidence and control with your surroundings and within yourself. So essentially, it means doing things that make you feel accomplished, whether getting better at something you already feel confident about or learning something new. It's a concept that can help us experience and recognize our accomplishments and help us to think and feel more competent, in control, and capable. So when you're regularly engaging in such activities, your thinking starts to shift to a more positive mindset. So when you're consistently doing things that build self-esteem and confidence, it doesn't have such an impact when you encounter something that's more challenging. So building mastery is about scheduling activities that challenge you but are doable to bring about a mindset of accomplishment and control. And so it's pretty straightforward to do. You just make time each day, even if it's just 10 minutes, to do something that makes you feel accomplished, in control, and good about yourself. And obviously the key is to plan for success. So pick something that's difficult, but possible. You want to challenge yourself, but not be unreasonable. So for example, if you're planning a 5K marathon, but have never run before, you don't start by running 5K, you start in smaller bits and gain success. So you want to look for a challenge. Doing things that are easy and take no effort doesn't help build esteem and confidence. So you need things that are going to make you feel accomplished, and this will be different for everyone. Also make sure you're not comparing yourself to others, because we all have different things that challenge us. Ask yourself what's reasonable and realistic for me, and appreciate yourself for whatever efforts you do make. And I want to highlight, we don't need to think super big, like learning a new language or learning a new musical instrument. When we're stressed and overwhelmed, we can feel unmotivated to take on anything else, and even daily tasks can seem overwhelming. So building mastery doesn't have to be a huge task. Sometimes it's as simple as making yourself a healthy dinner or responding to an email. And if you're struggling with your emotion, starting with some of these smaller things that can build up confidence to remind you that you are capable, which then gives you the motivation to move on to larger things. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, when we're not super stressed, we all juggle an enormous amount of tasks, taking care of family, work tasks, home life, personal life. But when we're stressed, so many of these tasks become so much harder, and that leaves us feeling depleted. And so it's important to recognize that and know that that's normal and understandable. And I honestly can't tell you during the pandemic, or even now, the state of my home. And I'm just going to tell you, I'm happy that the background can be blurred so you can't see what's going on behind me. But the point is, when stress piles up, even basic things can become difficult. So building mastery during times of stress might just be something very straightforward, including household activities that you've been postponing. So things like cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, eating balanced meals are things that take effort and energy to accomplish. So if you've let some of those things go as the stress builds up, it can contribute to negative thinking. And so pick one of those things on your list and start to make a plan to do it little by little. And as you build confidence with basic activities, you can move on to more advanced goals. Okay, and the final strategy for mental well-being that I wanted to focus on is the gratitude journal. This could also go under spiritual well-being, but there's a ton of research to suggest that cultivating an attitude of gratitude and feeling grateful for what you have in your present life is associated with greater happiness or subjective well-being. And so, as I mentioned, when we're stressed, we tend to filter the world through more negative lenses and see things that aren't going well. And this, of course, further impacts our stress level and mood. And so research suggests that an attitude of gratitude can potentially lower our blood pressure, improve our immune function, facilitate more efficient sleep. And it actually gratitude reduces the lifetime risk for depression, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, and is a key factor in enhancing resiliency. So one way to do this is by savoring the moment when something positive happens to you, rather than taking those things for granted. And we could be grateful for many things. And it could be as simple everyday pleasures, like a tasty meal, finishing a project. It could be a positive interaction. It could be awareness of your own physical health or people in your life, or overcoming an obstacle, or a funny television show, or simply being alive, or moments of natural beauty, or gestures of kindness from others. So one way to practice gratitude is by taking a few moments out of the day to write in a gratitude journal. So here are some tips for a gratitude journal: is don't just go through the motions. Research suggests journaling is more effective if you make the conscious decision to become happier and more grateful. So motivation really plays a huge role in the benefits of journaling. Go for depth over breadth. So elaborate in detail about a particular thing for which you're grateful carries more benefits than a superficial list of many things. Get personal. So focus on people to whom you are grateful has a lot more impact than focusing on things for which you're grateful. Although, of course, you can include things. Try subtraction, not just addition. So one effective way of stimulating gratitude is to reflect on what your life would be like without certain blessings, rather than just tallying up all the good things. Savor surprises. So unexpected things can elicit stronger levels of gratitude. Don't overdo it. So writing occasionally 2 to 3 times a week can actually be more beneficial than daily journaling. And gratitude is actually something that can be really helpful to do as a family. So perhaps at dinner time or in the car or the end of the day, going around and asking each person one thing they're grateful for that day. Again, it doesn't need to be big things, but small things that we can take time to appreciate can really help shift our mindset. And so again, I've included some resources here for you if you want to read up more on gratitude or building mastery. Okay, the last thing before we get into the social supports that I wanted to talk about is spiritual well-being. And this is means different things for different people. And it really is about, it lets us find meaning in life events and define our individual purpose. And for some people that comes from religion, from some people it doesn't, but it's about developing a harmony with your inner self and the outside world. And it also involves the care, compassion, and support of others. And positive spiritual coping, including spiritual support, positive reframing of stressors, and spiritual connectedness can help enhance our resilience by helping to buffer us from our experience of adversity. And so the main tool I wanted to discuss here is self-compassion. So life is messy. Things don't always go the way we want or hoped or dreamed of. When kids struggle, caregivers often question themselves and their ability as a caregiver. And the thing that's essential to know is that there are no perfect people, and there are certainly no perfect parents. And trying to be perfect is a huge source of stress. And I've both for biological parents, I've worked with adoptive parents, I've worked with foster parents, I've worked with all kinds of caregivers. And what I can tell you is there is no such thing as being perfect, but trying to be perfect is such a source of stress. And it is so important for all of us to accept that we are just doing the best we can, and we are more than enough just the way that we are. And you don't have to be perfect to be kind to yourself. So instead of judging yourself, nurture yourself through the stress. Talk to yourself like someone you adore. Be your own cheerleader. If you're not emotionally generous to yourself, it's really harder to be emotionally generous to others. So compassion involves sensitivity to the experience of suffering, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. And it's reflected in many different religions and spiritual practices. But when we discuss compassion, we're usually talking about something directed at others and rarely look at treating ourselves with compassion. But compassion for ourselves is really no different than having compassion for others. So it really involves acting the same way towards yourself when you're having a difficult time as you would towards others. So when we make a mistake or fail in some way, we tend to beat ourselves up. But instead of just ignoring your pain or telling yourself that you've done something wrong, what if we stopped and told ourselves, this is really difficult right now. How can I comfort and care for myself? And so it means that you honor and accept your humanness. So things won't always go the way we want. We will encounter frustrations. Losses will occur. We will make mistakes. We will fall short of our ideals. And that is what it means to be human. And it's a reality shared by all of us. So with self-compassion, you value yourself not because you've judged yourself positively and others negatively, but because you're intrinsically deserving of care and concern like everybody else. And so it's really thought to enhance well-being because it deactivates our threat system. And so Dr. Kristen Neff, she's a professor in the US who's done a ton of work on self-compassion, and she says it consists of these 3 components. So self-kindness is being loving towards ourselves instead of critical. Acknowledging a common humanity that everyone suffers, you're not perfect, no one is, and then being mindful. So noticing our feelings without judging them, accepting them and tolerating them. And again, I've included links for you, but one activity that I find particularly helpful for self-compassion is to ask yourself, how would you treat a friend? So think about times when a close friend feels really bad about themselves and is really struggling in some way. How would you respond to your friend in that situation? What do you do? What do you say? What is the tone you take? Now think about times when you feel bad about yourself or are struggling. How do you respond to yourself in those situations? What do you say? What do you do? What's the tone you talk to yourself? Is there a difference? And if so, ask yourself why. what factors or fears come into play that lead you to treat yourself so differently from how you treat others? And how do you think that could change? How could you start to treat yourself more like you would treat your friend? And I've included some resources here. Okay, the last dimension I want to briefly discuss is social well-being. And social support, as I mentioned, is one of the most important and essential elements of resilience and really buffers the effects of stress. It's one of the best ways you could empty your basket. And social disconnection has actually been seen to be more harmful to our health than smoking. So it's really important for us to identify our team. As I said at the beginning, we all need a team of social support so we're not disconnected. And so I've listed here some resources for supports in Ontario. So there's the Family Care Centre by Parents of Children's Mental Health. So that's this group here, which has a resource hub for parents, and then also peer support chapters. So strongly recommend getting connected to that. The program where I work and that I mentioned to you is the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program. This is a program that provides free services for adults based in cognitive behavior therapy for a variety of mood and anxiety concerns. So stress, low mood, anxiety, panic, obsessive compulsive disorder, and trauma. And how it works is you call, it's free, you self-refer, and then a clinician meets with you over the phone to do an intake assessment, and then we figure out what program is the best match for you. So we have some low intensity services, we call them, which are more self-guided. You get workbooks and you meet either with a mental health coach or a clinician, and for short sessions kind of to discuss the workbook material. And it ranges all the way up to what you would think of as more traditional therapy, where it's hour-long sessions. They're all either on phone, video, or in-person services are offered, and it's free to anyone in Ontario. So I've included a website there where you could find which would be the location in your area, because there's many different sites in Ontario that offer this program. There's also the Sash Bear program, which is a 24-hour group program divided up over several weeks for people who are in relationship with someone who has emotion regulation or related problems. It's provided free of charge, and it teaches caregivers different tools or family members different tools or strategies to cope and support their loved one who's having severe emotion dysregulation. And then Sick Kids also on their mental health learning hub, they have a bunch of links and resources for parents, including support groups and other online resources. So I've included all of this here, and I really encourage you to reach out and connect with some of these resources because social support is so important. Okay. So here are those planning sheets I told you about. And now in our last few minutes, I hope the tools I just shared with you to help you empty your basket are helpful. And remember, don't wait for your basket to overflow before emptying it. Small doses of self-care are the most beneficial to ensure that your basket never overflows and that you're able to stay regulated. And all of the strategies I shared with you are also strategies you can use to help your child empty their basket. But to end this presentation, I'm going to share one more way you can help your child empty their basket by coaching them through it. Because I know that having the tools to support your child helps to lower your stress. And remember, I'm going to start by reiterating what I said earlier. Giving ourselves and our kids permission to feel our feelings is essential. So many of us grew up with messages like, don't cry, don't be sad, don't be mad. And this creates a culture where we don't know how to tolerate our feelings. We try to avoid it. Instead, we need to teach our kids to identify and tolerate their emotions and to learn strategies to soothe them. So we really need to teach them how to empty their baskets in healthy ways. And we want to support them to be aware of what they're feeling, tolerate it, and kind of decrease the intensity. And we do this by being an emotion coach. And this is where we as adults need to have a big emotional basket, because in order to be an emotion coach, first and foremost, we need to be able to remain calm and regulated ourselves. And our child needs to know that we're in control of our feelings and that we're able to help kind of catch their overflow. So there's 4 steps to emotion coaching. The first step is to acknowledge the emotion. So whenever a child's showing you a strong feeling, acknowledge that you notice they're having a big feeling. So for example, I could tell something's up right now. The second step is to label it. Help put the child's experience into words. So you look mad, you seem sad. You might be familiar with the expression, we have to name it to tame it. If you're not entirely sure what your child's feeling, it's okay to guess with, I wonder if you might feel, or I can imagine you might feel. The third step is to validate the emotion. So when adults understand a child's internal state and reflect their emotions back to them in consistent and empathic ways, this helps the child become more aware of, label, and understand their own mental states, and then teaches them how to regulate their emotional stress. And so we do this through validation, which is really recognizing and accepting another person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors by communicating understanding of their perspective and or experience in a kind and supportive manner. And validation's a really useful tool when we're trying to teach kids to regulate strong feelings, because it helps them feel understood and reduces the intensity of the emotion, and therefore opens the door to problem solving. Validation sounds straightforward, but it's actually very tricky. So how we validate is to put ourselves in their shoes and see a situation from their perspective, and then demonstrate that we can understand where they're coming from. And we use the word because instead of the word but. So that's where validation becomes tricky. Because think about it, how often do we say things to kids or to other adults for that matter, such as, I know you're mad, but you shouldn't yell, or I know you're sad that your friend can't hang out, but you can reschedule, and so on. And we often use the word but in our efforts to soothe someone. However, the word but actually invalidates the person's experience, because essentially we're saying you shouldn't feel that way you feel, and we're trying to erase the feeling with a solution. Instead, when validating, we use the word because to demonstrate that we understand from their perspective why they are feeling the way they're feeling. And when we do this, we're helping a child regulate their emotions, which then makes them more open and receptive to suggestions or problem solving or soothing of the emotion. So research has shown that it's often helpful to use 3 becauses to really help a child feel understood. So for example, it might be something like, I understand you might feel mad because you really wanted that toy, and it's really hard when we want something we can't have, and I said no and you don't agree with it. Or I understand you might be sad because you really wanted to see your friend today, and because now you don't get to go to do that activity, and because you really enjoy your time with them. When you validate a child in this way, they're not having to think of the words themselves. They're not having to convince you of how they're feeling. You're preemptively showing them that you know and understand what their inner experience is. And when there's a match between a child's internal state and their external environment, their brain's alarm can calm down. And I want to highlight, validating a feeling is not the same as validating a behavior. So if a child's physically or verbally aggressive, that behavior is not okay. We don't say that's okay. What we're validating is their feeling, even if their emotion is coming from a misinterpretation. Their feeling makes sense given their perspective. That's the message. If a child's engaged in challenging behavior, then we can correct it, and we use the word and instead of but. So for example, I can see you're angry because I said no and you really wanted that treat and because it feels unfair. And we don't hit, so let's figure out how we can use our words when we're angry. By using the word and, what we're communicating is that it's okay for them to feel however they're feeling, and there are acceptable ways to handle those feelings. And then the final step to emotion coaching is meeting their needs. So if a child's sad, offer them comfort. If they're afraid, offer them safety and security. If they're angry, it might be to help them set a boundary. So for example, I wonder if it might help us take our mind off the treat by going outside and playing with the ball. And okay, I'm going to go through this one really quick. I know I went through that all quickly, and I'm going to give you online videos and scripts and other tools that cover all that information, but I just wanted to capture, I just wanted to capture a couple of points here. So remember, when emptying our baskets or helping our kids empty theirs, that we want to convey the message, all emotions are okay. Emotions are natural and normal. We validate the emotion, not the behavior. We empathize from their point of view. It doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means telling them we understand their point of view. When correcting the behavior, use the word and instead of but. So I understand you're angry and it's not okay to scream. What can we do instead? Support can include comfort, reassurance, togetherness. And on the next slide here, I've provided some more ideas of things like escape or distraction, physical energy, release ideas. So things you can help for them to empty their basket when they're having a meltdown and you've calmed their brain. And then I had a little video here about the power of validation. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, I won't show it now, but I encourage you to watch it if you get a chance. Oh, and now let me just move on. Here are some coaching. Oh, okay. Sorry. We're in like the final part and I stopped my screen sharing and now I don't know. Okay. Hang on, we're almost there. I will resume. This is just some resources and scripts for you that I've included. And then here's the website that I told you about. The emotion coaching, there's scripts there. There's a video series on validating anger. It's the website called Mental Health Foundations. Dr. Adela Frank, she's an expert in emotion coaching. So I've included a bunch of resources for you here. Okay, so in sum, as I've rushed through that, said so much at the very end, it brings me to the end of the presentation, but I just want to remind you of a few things. It is okay to feel whatever you are feeling. Your feelings are essential in letting you know what you need. And it's essential as caregivers to pay attention to your own well-being in order to be able to support your child. So remember, you can't pour from an empty cup. Self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary. We're all imperfect parents, and that's perfectly okay. Tiny humans need connection, not perfection. And remember to empty your basket so that you can catch your child's overflow. And then, as I told you, because I find these images and then I end up loving them, I found this one too, and I got a bit carried away. So it's when your child's struggling, remember, you can feel all your feelings, even if they seem wrong. Listen to the experts, but trust your gut. Love your child, but wish things were easier. You can be polite, but advocate like a bear. You can be kind to yourself, even if you feel ineffective. You can put yourself first so that you could keep on giving. You could set boundaries, even when it's awkward. You could hold joy and sorrow at the same time. And you could believe you're a superhero that's perfectly imperfect. And with that, I thank you so much for taking the time to focus on your own well-being, because that is one of the best things you could do to support your child who's struggling. And then I told you I had some resources there for blocked care. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing.